Hello, everyone. I'm Audrey Chapuis, the director of the American Library in Paris, and I'm so pleased to be with you here this evening to hear Maurice on his book, The Betrayal of the Duchess. His book was actually shortlisted for the American Library Book Award, and we will be celebrating the shortlisted books as well as announcing the winner on January 14th, so please save that date. If you're new to the library, there are many of you who are not library members. I urge you to discover the benefits of library membership. You don't have to be in Paris to enjoy those rewards. And for those of you who do know us well, you'll know that the library is entirely community supported. And I just want to thank you for participating in the life of the library and supporting our institution, and especially the Grow at Annenberg Foundation for supporting this program in particular. And since the holidays are upon us, I wanted to remind you that the library has some nice gift ideas for you. You can sponsor a shelf in the new children's library that will be unveiled in the new year. You can buy gift memberships for your friends and loved ones. And of course, the Centennial tote bag is a great stocking stuffer or even a stocking itself. You can also make a gift in honor of a friend or a loved one. We are in the midst of our end of year campaign. And as I mentioned, we are community run. So every single gift makes a difference. So thank you for your time and please enjoy this talk. Back over to Catherine Oline, our programs manager.
Thank you, Audrey. Yeah, so I'll just be introducing Maurice, who's our speaker this evening, before handing over the presentation to him. So Dr. Maurice Samuels is the Betty Jane Anlian Professor of French at Yale University, where he's also the founding director of the Yale Program for the Study of Anti-Semitism. A recipient of the Guggenheim Fellowship, he is the author of 3 previous books, including The Right to Difference, French Universalism and the Jews. He lives in New Haven, Connecticut and New York City. And tonight he'll be speaking to us about, as Audrey said, the book that was shortlisted for the American Library in Paris Book Award, The Betrayal of the Duchess, the scandal that unmade the Bourbon monarchy and made modern France. Thank you for being here, Maurice.
Well, thank you, Catherine, and thanks to Audrey and to the American Library in Paris. I'm really honored to be named a finalist for the book prize and to have a chance to talk about the book with all of you. And I see some familiar faces out there, so hi to everyone I know. Okay, so we have a slideshow, so maybe we'll start that. Yeah, let's go back to the first slide. Great. Okay, so this is a book about an extraordinary woman, a very determined 4'7" duchess who led a civil war to reconquer the French throne for the Bourbons in 1832. It's also about the man who betrayed her, who was the son of France's chief rabbi, and it's about the firestorm of hatred against Jews that the betrayal unleashed, which I argue was the first real outpouring of anti-Semitism in modern France and set the stage for the Dreyfus affair some 60 years later. So I'm going to start by telling the remarkable story, which shocked me when I first came across it a decade ago doing research for a different book. I'll then discuss what the betrayal has to teach us about the origins of modern anti-Semitism, and I'll conclude by giving a brief sense of how this story has been remembered or not remembered over the past 200 years, and then we'll open it up for questions. And I think that the case raises a lot of them. So first, the facts of the case, and let's go to the next slide. The Duchess de Berry was born Maria Carolina Ferdinanda Luisa di Bourbon in 1798 in Naples, the granddaughter of its king. Forced to flee to Sicily as a baby with the rest of the Bourbon court when the French revolutionary forces occupied Naples, the Duchess imbibed a hatred of revolution with her wet nurse's milk. In 1816, she married her older distant cousin. Let's go to the next slide. The Duc de Berry, who was the playboy nephew of the French king Louis XVIII. And she came to France just as the Bourbon Restoration was getting underway. The Bourbons had returned to power in France after the fall of Napoleon and immediately tried to set back the clock, to pretend like the French Revolution had never taken place. Aristocrats recovered their fortunes and political power, as did the Catholic Church, which the Bourbon monarchy saw as a crucial ally in its effort to restore traditional social values along with traditional power structures in France. As the youngest and most glamorous, actually the only glamorous member of the Bourbon royal family, the Duchess de Berry played a key role in helping to brighten the Bourbon's stodgy, mournful image. Thanks to her flair for fashion, lavish parties, and patronage of the arts, the young Duchess immediately became the toast of Paris. In portraits of her from the era, and let's go to the next slide. In portraits of her from the era, she has very blonde hair, very pale skin, and a left eye that wanders slightly as if on the lookout for excitement. In 1820, after only a few years of marriage, her husband was assassinated during a trip to the opera by a radical anti-monarchist and bled to death in her arms. Let's go to the next slide. Here is an image of the Duke's deathbed in the foyer of the opera, one of many similar images that circulated across France and helped make the Duchess a martyr for the royalist cause, much like her guillotined great aunt, Marie Antoinette. Since there were no other Bourbons capable of producing children, the assassin believed he had ended the French royal bloodline once and for all. But the Duchess shocked the nation by revealing that she was 2 months pregnant. Despite rumors that she was faking and attempts to set off firecrackers outside her window at the Tuileries Palace to scare her into a miscarriage, 7 months after the assassination, the Duchesse de Berry gave birth to a son, Henri, dubbed the Miracle Child, l'enfant du miracle. And if we can go to the next slide. This is a picture of the Duchess with her son a few years later. So royalists credited the Duchess with saving the French monarchy, and the young widow's stock rose considerably in the 1820s. Her position as mother of the Bourbon heir, giving her standing within the royal family, where she was engaged in a power struggle with her childless and disapproving sister-in-law, the Duchesse d'Angoulême. And if we go to the next slide, that's the Duchesse d'Angoulême, who sought to push their mutual father-in-law, the new King Charles X, in an increasingly reactionary direction. When another revolution broke out in 1830, caused mainly by the reactionary politics of Charles X, the Duchesse de Berry, alone among the Bourbon royal family, wanted to stay and fight. Appearing before the king in a man's riding outfit with a pair of pistols dangling from her belt, the Duchess begged for permission to go to the far western province of the Vendée, long seen as a hotbed of conservative royalism, in order to stir up a counter-revolutionary army against Louis Philippe, the cousin of the Bourbons from the rival Orléans branch of the royal family, who was about to be crowned King of the French by the revolutionaries. The soon-to-be ex-king, Charles X, refused the Duchess's plea, and she reluctantly joined the mournful cortege of her Bourbon in-laws as they made their way to England for yet another exile. But while Charles X and the Duchesse d'Angoulême licked their wounds in the drafty Scottish castle of Holyrood, the Duchesse de Berry immediately began scheming to recapture the throne for her son. Leaving Henri and his sister behind, she made her way to Italy, assuming a series of disguises and false names in order to elude the agents of Louis Philippe, who were monitoring her every move. In the fall of 1831, from the small Tuscan town of Massa on the Ligurian coast, she gathered around her a close band of conspirators. For the most part, she chose her associates well. Drawn from some of the highest aristocratic families in the nation, they were all willing to die for her cause. She made only one miscalculation, and it would prove her undoing. Let's go to the next slide. So at first glance, Simon Deutz might seem like a surprising choice to become the trusted confidant of the Duchess. He was a humble commoner and an immigrant. Born in Koblenz, Germany in 1802, he moved to Paris as a child and had worked as a printer's apprentice, not the type to associate with royalty. Even more improbably, he had been born a Jew. In any previous century, his itinerary would have been unthinkable. But Simon was born at a time of unprecedented social change for France in general and for Jews in particular. In 1790 and 91, during the early days of the revolution, France became the first modern European nation to grant full civil rights to the Jews. The revolution opened new possibilities for Jews to transform themselves, to join mainstream society, to rise up economically and socially while remaining Jews. Or, really for the first time, they had the option to leave Judaism behind. Now, many Jews of Simon's generation, the first to be born as French citizens, took advantage of these opportunities to invent new identities for themselves. It's safe to say, though, that almost none sought so complete a change as Simon Deutz. Simon was not just any Jew. As I said at the start, he was the son of France's chief rabbi, Emmanuel Deutz. And let's go to the next slide. So born in 1763, Emmanuel was the rabbi in Koblenz, a town on the bank of the Rhine in the Palatinate, one of the German states that Napoleon conquered on his march eastward. When Napoleon's troops entered the town in 1794, they tore down the gate which kept the Jewish population locked in a ghetto and gave the region's Jews the same rights that the revolution had granted to Jews in France a few years before. A decade later, in 1806, when the now Emperor Napoleon convened a body of Jewish notables, which he grandiosely dubbed the Grand Sanhedrin after the ancient rabbinical court, Emmanuel Deutz made his way to Paris to form part of this august body, which Napoleon charged with laying down the limits of Jewish religious law and sanctioning the integration of Judaism into the French imperial state. After the Sanhedrin disbanded, Emmanuel Deutz was asked to stay on as one of the 3 chief rabbis in France. And after his 2 colleagues departed, he remained as the sole chief rabbi, the religious and administrative head of French Judaism. Emmanuel Deutz settled his large family in the Marais, then as now the center of Parisian Jewish life. A modest man who never fully learned French and continued to deliver sermons in his native Yiddish, Rabbi Deutz was beloved by the poor and traditional Jews who made up the majority of the Parisian Jewish population in the early 19th century. However, he was disliked by the modernizers, the ambitious Jews who had begun to take advantage of the new possibilities opened by the French Revolution to rise up the social and economic ladder. This hostility would turn into all-out war a few years after his son Simon scandalized the community. And I'd be happy to come back to that war in the question period. Simon was a restless, troubled youth. Unable to settle down, he tried multiple professions, studying to become a rabbi before giving that up to become a printer and dabbling at various other enterprises, none successfully. But he was not the first member of the family to create a scandal. David Drack, the husband of Simon's eldest sister, Sarah, who was the director of the Jewish school in Paris and was widely seen as a likely candidate to succeed his father-in-law as chief rabbi, abruptly converted to Catholicism in 1823, secretly baptizing his children, the chief rabbi's grandchildren, as well. Shocked by her husband's actions, Sarah Drack managed to disappear with the children to England, where her husband eventually tracked her down re-kidnapped the children, and secreted them away in Catholic institutions back in France as he made a career for himself as a Catholic theologian, specializing in exhorting his fellow Jews to convert. Nobody in the Deutz family reacted with more outrage to Drax's conversion than Simon, who undertook a campaign to harass his brother-in-law that lasted for several years until Simon suddenly decided to follow him into the church in 1828. Now, any Jew who converted in early 19th century France gained notoriety. There were only about 5 conversions a year between 1815 and 48, at a time when the Jewish population of the capital grew to more than 10,000. But Simon's conversion created an enormous scandal because of his father's position as chief rabbi. And this was exactly what Simon had banked on, hoping to use his abjuration to attract the attention of prominent Catholic Church officials and aristocrats who could help lift him out of poverty and obscurity. And his plan worked. Indeed, so big a stir did his abjuration create that Simon was invited to Rome, where the Pope put him on the payroll of the Holy See. And it was Gregory XVI himself who recommended Deutz to the Duchess de Berry as someone she could trust as she plotted her civil war to recapture the throne for her son. A better recommendation would have been hard to find. So all through 1831, the Duchess and her lieutenants watched as the political situation in France deteriorated, trying to determine the best moment to launch their campaign to reconquer the throne. Let's go to the next slide. Louis-Philippe was not popular. Here's a caricature from the time comparing his head to a pear that could be found on walls all over the capital in 1831. But in the spring of 1832, the king's popularity took a nosedive thanks to a pandemic of cholera that ravaged Paris. And this is one of the uncanny ways in which this book that I wrote, obviously, a couple years ago now, came to seem incredibly relevant. There's a chapter on the cholera outbreak. 20,000 people died in Paris over the course of just a few months, and discontent with Louis-Philippe reached quite literally a fever pitch. The funeral procession of a left-wing hero, General Lamarck, who had died of cholera, became the pretext for Republicans, those who wanted to replace the monarchy with a democratic republic, to launch what they hoped would be another revolution. They erected barricades in the central districts of Paris, but were brutally crushed by Louis-Philippe's forces. And this is probably familiar to you if you're a fan of Les Miserables, because it forms the climax of Victor Hugo's novel, that episode. Few today, however, remember that this was also the moment that the Duchess de Berry chose to launch her revolution from the right. She set sail for Marseille in May of 1832. When the uprising she had timed to coincide with her arrival in Marseille fizzled, she turned her sights on the province of the Vendée, donning a series of increasingly outlandish disguises in order to make her way unobserved from the southern coast of France to the far west of the country. But a series of miscommunications doomed her insurrection. When the first battle finally took place, government troops easily routed the Bourbon loyalists. Though they fought bravely in later skirmishes, the Duchess's soldiers were on the run by summer 1832. Needing time to regroup, the Duchess sought refuge in Nantes, hiding out with several of her closest supporters in the attic of the house of the Du Guigny sisters, ardent legitimists, as the supporters of the Bourbon monarchy had begun to call themselves in opposition to the illegitimate monarchy of Louis-Philippe. Let's go to the next slide. So this is the house, at least as it looks now. I took this picture. It's the house where the Duchess hid in the attic. Simon Deutz, meanwhile, began to waver in his commitment to the Duchess. After acting as her emissary to the kings of Spain and Portugal, Deutz offered his services to Adolphe Thiers, Louis Philippe's Minister of the Interior, promising to lead government agents to where the Duchess was hiding. Deutz arrived in Nantes in October 1832, and after a few weeks of courting the local legitimists, he managed to arrange a meeting with the Duchess at her secret hideaway on the evening of November 6th, 1832. Not wanting to miss the opportunity of capturing the Duchess, the government stationed 1,200 troops, 2 entire army regiments outside that house. As soon as Deutz exited, the police burst through the door. However, the Duchess was nowhere to be found. At the first sign of the raid, she and 3 accomplices had slipped into a tiny compartment behind the fireplace in the attic, where they stayed hidden for 16 hours while the police ransacked the house. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so if you can see, here's a map of the attic where she was hiding, and down below there's a floor plan with the tiny hidden compartment, the kind of trapezoidal, kind of triangular space that's shaded in there. So the Duchess and her fellow outlaws held their breath and tried not to move as the police settled in for the night. November, as some of you might know, is a cold month in Nantes, and eventually the police stationed in the attic decided to light a fire, filling the secret compartment with smoke and rendering its walls burning hot. The Duchess's dress caught on fire at several moments. Finally, the outlaws could stand it no more and crawled out through the fireplace grate. To the shock of the soldiers, the tiny soot-covered military leader summoned her most regal bearing and declared, "I am the Duchess de Berry. You are French soldiers. I entrust myself to your honor." Let's go to the next slide. This is a popular print from the time. There were dozens of these showing the dramatic scene of the Duchess and her fellow outlaws crawling out of the fireplace. So when news hit of the arrest, when it hit Parisian papers the following day, Louis Philippe and his ministers found themselves in a tricky position. There was pressure from the left-wing advocates of a republic to put the Duchess on trial for leading a civil war, but convicting her, could prove even more dangerous than letting her go free. Her imprisonment or execution for treason would turn her into a martyr for the right-wing legitimists. So the government kept the royal widow locked up at the citadel of Blaye for months while they decided what to do. And let's go to the next slide. This is the house where the Duchess was imprisoned at the citadel, where she was in fact the only prisoner. Louis Philippe had scored a major victory in capturing the fugitive Duchess, but he didn't realize just how major. At the moment of her arrest, the widowed Duchess was 3 months pregnant. As the leader of a party devoted to traditional Catholicism, she faced humiliation and the end of her political ambitions once this illegitimate pregnancy was made known. Although the legitimist papers kept denying the pregnancy until the very end, the Duchess gave birth in prison in May of 1833. The government made sure that the birth itself took place in full view of the public, so the partisans of the Duchess couldn't suppress it. Hours after delivery, she released the name of the father, an obscure Italian count whom everyone knew she had not seen in years, if ever, although the Vatican came through with a backdated marriage certificate. While she saved a measure of face through this maneuver, Louis Philippe triumphed. The Duchess effectively ceased to play a political role after the scandal. She passed the rest of her life in exile in Austria and Italy, and the Bourbons never did regain the throne. Let's go to the next slide. Here she is as an old woman. She died in 1870. Simon Deutz, meanwhile, became infamous. Although he would claim in a self-justifying memoir published in 1835 that he had turned in the Duchess to save France from civil war, he received the enormous sum of 500,000 francs for the deed. And let's go to the next slide. This is a receipt in his hand contained in the papers of Adolphe Thiers, the Minister of the Interior. Within a few years, however, Simon had blown through the money, probably on gambling. The government eventually gave him a small allowance, provided he would leave the country, and he seems to have died under a false name in New Orleans in 1844, his real name remaining a synonym for treason in France until at least the end of the 19th century. Although I have some other theories about what might have happened to him that I'm happy to come back to in the question period. So let's stop the slideshow here, and I have a couple more things to say about the meaning of the case. Thank you. A handful of recent historians have studied the Duchess de Berry, focusing mainly on her role in 19th century politics. However, few scholars have explored in detail her relationship with Deutz and the episode of the arrest, and it's not hard to see why. Unlike Alfred Dreyfus, the Jewish officer who was falsely accused of treason in the 1890s and who represents a kind of model victim of anti-Semitism, or at least a blameless one, Deutz is a pretty unsavory character, an opportunist, a narcissist, and a liar. And unlike Dreyfus, he was actually guilty of betrayal, even if his crime doesn't amount to high treason, as the Duchess's right-wing supporters alleged. In the remainder of this talk, I'd like to suggest that his case is nevertheless important to examine because it represents a turning point in the way that Jews were imagined and represented in France. Many scholars have described how Jews became scapegoats for the resentments bred by the upheaval that followed from the political and economic revolutions of the 19th century. Much of this scholarship is focused on the end of the 19th century, the 1880s and 90s, the period in which anti-Semitism became a potent political force. But it was actually in the early 19th century that the old religious and economic forms of Jew hatred, which had marked French life for centuries prior to the French Revolution, mutated into something more modern. I argue in the book that the story of the betrayal of the Duchess de Berry brought these resentments into focus and into the mainstream of French political discourse. It did so in part because the story's two main characters, the Duchess and Deutz, seemed like such clear embodiments of the opposing poles in the debate over modernity. Right from the start of her capture, the right-wing press presented the Duchess as a glorious anachronism, a figure out of sync with modern life and a throwback to a more chivalrous era. She was great, noble, and beautiful in the fields of the Vendée, declared La Mode, one of the main journals devoted to the Duchess, while La Quotidienne, another right-wing publication, praised her courage and noble misfortune. She displayed all the qualities of a hero who fights for a cause he considers just, declared La Gazette du Languedoc, the fiercest of the right-wing papers shortly after the Duchess's arrest. For these writers, the Duchess came to serve as an emblem of devotion to ideals rather than self-interest, and hence a rebuke to a capitalist era governed by individualism and petty calculation. In the legend that took shape around the Duchess, her heroism and lack of self-interest signified in direct contrast to the greed-motivated betrayal of Deutz. We have met a second Judas, wrote La Quotidienne on November 19th, 1832, after the identity of the Duchess's betrayer was made known. Le Revenant, another right-wing paper, called Deutz an odious Jew and contrasted his venality not only with the generous, heroic actions of the Duchess, but also with the disinterest of Marie Boissy, a servant in the house in which the Duchess was captured, who supposedly refused to betray her mistress even after being offered 40,000 francs by the government. The Bretonne servant redeems the Jewish renegade, Le Journal du Languedoc declared. It is good, noble girl. It is beautiful and noble. You honor us. You protect us. You have shown us all at once the distance that separates Judas from Marie, the German Jew from the Christian of France. So for these conservative writers, a certain notion of national identity was at stake in the arrest of the Duchess, a notion of Frenchness based on a mystical set of ideals, one that the Duchess naturally embodied despite the fact that she was born in Italy. The glorification of the Frenchness of the Duchess went hand in hand with an emphasis on Deutz's foreignness. Every newspaper published accounts detailing Deutz's foreign origins, although at the start, right after the arrest, the first accounts labeled him as Italian rather than German, no doubt because of the time he had spent in Italy where he met the Duchess. Right-wing commentators pointed to this foreignness with a sense of relief, since it meant that the Duchess wasn't betrayed by a fellow Frenchman. Although he had grown up on the streets of Paris, for the right-wing acolytes of the Duchess, Deutz could no more become French than he could cease to be Jewish after his conversion. And all of the papers called him a Jew, even though he had converted to Catholicism. So for the far right, I want to argue, the arrest of the Duchess dramatized a fundamental division in French national life. If the Duchess became a kind of secular saint, it was because her heroic but doomed civil war seemed to oppose the forces of political and economic modernity that by 1832 had begun to reshape France. These forces were perfectly embodied by Deutz: the protean shape-shifting, the lack of fidelity to religion, country, or cause, and most of all, the venality, the willingness to betray his God and his party for money. Deutz was not just any Jew, he was the emblem of everything that was scary and bad about the new era that the revolutions of 1789 and 1830 had inaugurated. He was, in the words of one writer, the Jew of the 19th century, a worthy instrument of the new dynasty, meaning the government of Louis Philippe. The association of Deutz with the liberal regime of Louis Philippe suggests that the anti-Semitism mobilized during the affair functioned as what the historian Shulamit Volkov has called a cultural code. According to her theory, anti-Semitism functions as a kind of shorthand, allowing anti-Semites to situate themselves in a political landscape. In this case, as hostile to liberalism in all its forms and to the changes wrought by modernity. I argued that the affair of Deutz and the Duchess was the crucial moment when this particular cultural code coalesced in France. This is not to say that elements of a similar code were not present in European discourse earlier than 1832, but the affair of Deutz and the Duchess was the first time that Jews would take on the full range of meanings they would have for later anti-Semites. And it was the first time that anti-Semitism offered a means of political positioning in France. Conservative writers like Chateaubriand and Victor Hugo, who opposed the government of Louis Philippe and liberal modernity more generally, inevitably viewed the story of the betrayal of the Duchess through an anti-Semitic lens. And in fact, Chateaubriand and Hugo both wrote a lot about the case, and I'm happy to come back to that too. More liberal writers, though, those who were aligned with Louis Philippe, such as Alexandre Dumas père, or those in the Republican opposition, saw the affair differently. The left-leaning newspapers and writers, by and large, avoided anti-Semitism in their coverage of the arrest. This is not to say that they approved of Deutz or defended his betrayal of the Duchess. Even those opposed to her politics admired her courage, and nobody had a nice word to say about Deutz. But they, by and large, refrained from making the connection between his betrayal and his Jewishness. So given that the affair helped crystallize anti-Semitism as a cultural code in France, it stands to reason that the case would fascinate France's most famous anti-Semite, Édouard Drumont, who more than 50 years after the events. In his 1886 bestseller, La France Juive, Jewish France, a 1,000-page screed that more than any other work was responsible for turning anti-Semitism into a political weapon and was read by Hitler later, Drumont summoned the episode of Deutz and the Duchess as proof of the fundamental foreignness of the Jews. But before recounting the story of the betrayal to his readers, he pauses to savor its perfections. Let us admit, in parentheses, how charming we find this episode to be, Drumont writes, how all the actors are in the right place. In French, he says, comme tous les acteurs sont bien à leur place. I want to dwell on this aside as I bring this talk to a conclusion, because I think it confirms the argument I'm trying to make. Drumont marvels at the fact that all the stereotypes that late 19th century anti-Semites would project onto the Jews were already present in the story of Deutz and the Duchess. And let's go here to the final slide, if we can go back. Okay, so is that there? Yeah, okay. So Drumont elaborates on this, and I'll read this quote. Here is the descendant of the Bourbons, the knightly, intrepid Aryan, convinced that the whole world is like her, breathing through her finely wrought nostrils the odor of gunpowder. Whom will she choose to trust? Will it be some artisan's son from the south? No, it's the oily, viscous, creeping, thick-lipped Jew who seizes hold of that confidence. Are there no French people of good sense to say to the mother of their king, what are you thinking, princess? The fathers of this wretch were persecuted, hunted, and burned by your august and royal ancestors. He hates you, and he is right to do so. Okay, so that's it for the slide. The dominant theme of Drumont's opus is that the revolution ushered in changes that would allow the Jews to lay hold of France's resources, and that the poor Aryans are powerless to stop them. It was this idea of casting the struggle over modernity as a war against the Jews that Drumont found ready-made in the story of Deutz and the Duchess, which Drumont treats almost as a current event. So relevant is it to his worldview, even though it took place 50 years before. And this is crucial. By playing their roles so well, the Duchess and Deutz wrote the script for subsequent anti-Semitic affairs. So it should come as no surprise that when the army discovered there was a traitor in its midst in 1894, a few years after Drumont published his book, suspicion would fall on Dreyfus, a Jew. Dreyfus fit a familiar pattern, a lineage of treachery inaugurated by Judas and reactivated by Deutz. Thanks to Drumont and all of the other writers who kept the legend of Deutz alive, the traitor could only be a Jew, and the Jew could only be a traitor. History seemed to repeat itself during the Dreyfus affair because the story of Deutz was still so familiar to French people. Deutz had implanted an image of the Jew as traitor that determined how the Dreyfus affair played out. It should also come as no surprise that the story of the arrest of the Duchess would resurface once again during World War II. As the Nazis and their French accomplices began to round up Jews and send them to concentration camps, fascist journalists resurrected the story of Deutz and the Duchess as proof of the Jews' perfidy. Writing in the pro-Nazi newspaper Aujourd'hui on January 12, 1942, the notorious Nazi collaborator René de Marmande describes overcoming his disgust at treating such an unsavory character as Deutz for the sake of the moral lesson his story provides. I quote, However repugnant it may be, the figure of Simon Deutz, baptized Jew, remains curious and in a certain way exemplary. For this journalist, the exemplarity of Deutz transcends even that of his biblical predecessor. And this story would be told several times during the occupation. In fact, the legend of Deutz would largely fade, though, from historical memory after World War II. Once the Holocaust made clear where such a cultural code could lead, anti-Semitism ceased to figure as a part of mainstream political discourse in France, and the tale of the arrest of the Duchess lost its grip on the popular imagination. By reviving the case in my book, I'm therefore taking a calculated risk. As the director of an academic program for the study of anti-Semitism, I'm all too aware of the hazards of discussing the greed-motivated betrayal by an immigrant Jew at a time when anti-Semitism is once again on the rise in France and elsewhere, including the United States. But I believe it's vital to revisit this case now, not in spite of resurgent anti-Semitism, but because of it. Analyzing the betrayal of the Duchess enables us to understand how the various assumptions that continue to govern attitudes toward Jews first crystallized into a political ideology. Simon Deutz really did betray the Duchess de Berry, but the myth that took shape around the betrayal turned it into something much larger than a mere historical anecdote. The betrayal became a way of channeling popular frustration with modernity. By revealing how this myth developed, we gain insight into the mechanism by which Jews and other minorities were demonized in the past and continue to be demonized today. We come to understand better what was at stake and what continues to be at stake when legitimate grievances find illegitimate targets. Only by examining our cultural myths in the bright light of history do we deprive them of their power. Thank you. So now I'm happy to take questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dr. Maurice Samuels. We'll give you a short round of applause, a short silent round of applause, I guess. Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. I do have a few questions coming in already, and please do feel free to continue to submit those in the chat feature. You can send them to everyone or send them to me privately and I'll read them aloud. Okay, so let's dive right in. The first one is someone who's curious about what happened to the Duchess's son, Henri.
Yeah, he's kind of a sad figure. So he spent the rest of his life in exile at the castle of Frosdorf in Austria, where he was raised by the Duchesse d'Angoulême, the Duchess's sad sister-in-law and bitter rival. And after her death, he stayed on there, waiting for the right moment to maybe come back to France and reconquer his kingdom. And there was a moment in 1870, so shortly after his mother's death, when after the Franco-Prussian War and the Commune, it seemed like France might elect a government that would be royalist in orientation, and they would invite him back to be the king. And he refused to do it unless France would give up the tricolor flag and adopt the white flag of the Bourbons. And that was a deal breaker, and he preferred to remain in exile. And the Bourbons never did regain the throne. But I should say actually also that he, though, gathered around him this kind of ersatz court of nobles who would come to pay homage to him. And it was this kind of sad thing where, you know, it was this sort of Versailles in miniature, but it was sort of pathetic and he had no actual power.
Okay, great, thank you. So the next question is, does this example of anti-Semitism echo with nationalist movements elsewhere in Europe in the 19th century, or is it exceptional?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. You know, there are definitely commonalities that link anti-Semitism in all of its national contexts in France. So there's a lot that links French anti-Semitism to German anti-Semitism. But interestingly, the French were ahead of the anti-Semitism curve in the 19th century. So, famously, people, during the Dreyfus affair, I mean, that was, France became the capital of anti-Semitism there. And, really probably if you would ask people in 1895, if you had said there's going to be a Holocaust, where will it take place? People probably would have said France at that point. But that French anti-Semitic model, including Drummond, influences the Germans, who also develop a nationalist, racist anti-Semitism. A lot of the racist anti-Semitic ideas come also from France. Someone named Gobineau was the first one to write an essay on the inequality of the human races in the 19th century. So there are many things in common. What I think one of the big differences, I think, though, is that France had actually been very good to the Jews. And that's one of the things I tried to emphasize in this talk, and that I tried to emphasize in the book, that in addition to the fact that anti-Semitism developed in France, France was the first country to give Jews full civil rights. And in the 19th century, they had many more rights than Jews in almost any other European country. So I think that in France, when the Holocaust eventually came to France, thanks to the Germans, I think that it came as more of a shock to French people, because they had that counter tradition also.
Great, thank you. So let's take another question here, which is, can you talk a bit about differences between French and American anti-Semitisms? And does the popular frustration with modernity that you mention play into the increase today as well?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I mean, I think that in the 19th century, there's no doubt that the US has less anti-Semitism than France, for instance. And one of the reasons for that might be that the Americans are less opposed to modernity. So this is a kind of merchant capitalist society from the beginning. We don't have a landed aristocracy that was dispossessed by modernity. So you don't see those same tensions that you see in Europe. But I don't want to give the impression, though, that the US does not have anti-Semitism in the 19th century. It certainly does. There are actually statutes in many states forbidding Jews from holding public office until late in the 19th century. But there are actually very few Jews in the US until the 1880s. And it's a really good question about whether an opposition to modernity is behind anti-Semitism now. I tend to think it is. I actually think that that's one of the things that links what scholars call the old anti-Semitism, which is the right-wing kind of anti-Semitism, largely what I'm talking about in this book, what the kind of traditionalist Catholics and displaced aristocrats felt. I think it's one of the things that links that to the new anti-Semitism, which is the Islamist variety, which France is definitely experiencing in a major way now. I think you could make the argument that a lot of the radical Islamists are also opposed to modernity, and that Jews, for them, once again, become a symbol of the things they don't like about the modern world, including liberalism, cosmopolitanism, things like that. So I think you could make that argument.
Okay, great. And we still have time for a few more questions if you want to finish typing those and prepare. But I think just following up on this question we've just had, I was sort of interested, if I can ask one of my own, in zooming out and asking you a little bit more about the work that you do as the director of the Yale program for the study of anti-Semitism. So what does that involve? What does that look like? And how does your research sort of contribute to that as well?
Yeah, so this is a program that started in 2011. And it's mostly, we have a lecture series, we give research grants, we organize conferences, and, the founding of it kind of coincided with this rise in anti-Semitism that we see around the world. So it's an interesting phenomenon, because by the end of the 20th century, people really started to think that anti-Semitism was on its way out, especially I would say in France. There were occasional instances, there were attacks by pro-Palestinian forces. There were some terrorist attacks in like the 80s and 90s, the desecration of a cemetery in Carpentras, things like that. But there really weren't major violent instances, too many of them. And then around the year 2000, everything changed. And you see a real upsurge in anti-Semitism. And France is really the epicenter of that. A lot of it is linked to events in the Middle East. So it's tied, it was kind of coincided with the second Intifada in Israel. But there's not a one-to-one correlation between like what goes on in Israel and what goes on in France, but they're definitely linked. And so, scholars realize that there have been a lot of people who've studied the right-wing kind of anti-Semitism. Not as many have studied this new brand of anti-Semitism from radical Islamists, and you could argue also from people on the left. And this is an important thing to acknowledge, that even in the period I study, the 19th century, there was also a brand of anti-Semitism on the left that was also opposed to capitalism and that took Jews as the emblems of capitalism. And of course, now there's a whole phenomenon of anti-Semitism on college campuses, the BDS movement, which some people think is anti-Semitic. And so there's been a lot to study and to try to map these instances of it. And that's one of the things that we try to do at the program I run, which is promoting the study of the new anti-Semitism, as well as the old.
Absolutely. Thank you for that overview. We've had some questions in the meantime, so let's go back to what about research? We have a question wondering, could you say a little bit about your research process for this book?
Yeah, so I mentioned that this was a case that I came upon when I was writing a different book. And any of you who've done research on a project, so I was at the Bibliothèque Nationale and, neck deep in research for a book I wrote on the first Jewish fiction writers in France. And I came across this case because Drac, who was the brother-in-law of Deutz, the one who converted first and then became the Catholic theologian, he was the tutor of one of the Jewish writers I wrote about. So I had never heard of this case. I mean, I'd been studying French Jewish history for a long time, and I couldn't believe what I was reading. And I went completely down a rabbit hole for like a week, where I read everything I could find about this case of the betrayal of the Duchess. I didn't even know that the Duchess had led a civil war. I mean, here was this female military commander. And, French historians who I've talked to kind of know who she is, but barely. Like, she barely rates a mention. And even Jewish historians don't really know about Deutz. He's mentioned by a couple Jewish historians. I can come back to that later, but there's really been very little written about him. And so I finally, a couple years later, came back to this, to the case. I read everything I could, especially the newspapers from the time were a big source. So this was a heyday of political journalism. And so there were dozens of newspapers, and they all covered the case in detail. Deutz himself wrote a memoir. Many of the Duchess's supporters and confidants wrote memoirs of the case. And then there are a lot of archival traces. So I spent a long time in the Archives Nationales. They have all kinds of letters that she wrote, all kinds of things. So and then there were a lot of visual sources also for the case, because as I said, it was also covered in popular prints from the time. So it was a really fun book to dive into and to research.
Great, thank you. So I have a few questions that are coming in around a similar theme. People are wondering if you can elaborate a little bit more on the events in Israel, or sort of Israel's role in the level of anti-Semitism in the US and France. So that's a huge question for you, but I have sort of three questions coming in all in that vein. So maybe want to address
Yeah,
it.
it's a big topic, and I would encourage everyone, if you're interested, to sign up for the mailing list for the Yale program for the study of anti-Semitism, YIPSA, because we've been, especially this year, doing Zoom talks, and some of them address those issues. So, as I said, there's not a one-to-one link, but there's definitely a link between opposition to the occupation in Israel and support for Palestinian rights. That unfortunately tends to, whatever you think about the occupation, I think it's clear to say that it's unfortunate that Jews in France get blamed for what goes on in Israel. Unfortunately, I think that a lot of young Muslim men in France who feel disenfranchised for various reasons, understandably maybe identify with Palestinians, that they, some of them, a small subset, and I think it's important to emphasize that it's a small subset, become radicalized by Islamist ideology and take it out on Jews. There's also a kind of casual anti-Semitism that I think is more and more common in France, and I hear reports all the time, and there have been studies in French public schools where Jewish students find it hard to, to be in these schools, and that, I think is linked certainly to what's the Israeli situation. But, you could ask yourself, does anti-Semitism need a motivating factor? If Israel got rid of, stopped the occupation tomorrow, would anti-Semitism go away? Probably not. So that's my short answer to a complicated question.
Great, thank you so much. And yeah, this conversation is also bringing to mind the winner of last year's book award, which was Mark Weitzman's Hate. And so a lot of the members of our community have read that book as well.
Yeah, and he came and spoke to our program too. Yeah, he was great. So yeah, I highly recommend his book. It's very good.
Yeah, and I've dropped a link to the Yale program for the study of anti-Semitism in the chat. So go ahead and, click that or bring that out before we sign off here, so that you have that handy if you're interested in seeing what that program is all about, and also to subscribing to the mailing list that Maurice has kindly notified us about. So I think that's all that we have time for tonight, but thank you so much for this talk, Maurice. This has been just tremendous, wonderful, and congratulations again on having been shortlisted for the book award.
Oh, well, thank you very much. It was really a pleasure. So, and thanks for organizing this.
Of course. And also to our audience, it's been a pleasure to have you here with us this evening virtually. We will continue programs for the coming months online. So if you feel free to check out our homepage or the programs calendar and see if there's anything you might like to sign up for. I've just updated that with links for everything through February, really. So there's a lot to choose from now. I'd also like to end by thanking any donors in the audience, as well as Rowan Annenberg, who is a sponsor for Evenings with an Author. And if you are interested in donating for tonight's event, it's sort of in person, we typically welcome donations of 10 euros if you enjoy the event. And so there is a link that would be an opportunity for you to support the library that went out in the email with the Zoom link as well. So thank you to those of you who support us, and we hope to see everyone again really soon in the next Evenings with an Author program. And thank you again to Maurice, of course, for being here.
Thanks.
All right, take care, everybody. Goodbye.